So some news broke the day before yesterday that President Trump was issuing an executive order that would lower drug prices. And I don't want to get bogged down into the issue of legality here, though I don't think constitutionally he can do this, nor do I think he or any other president in my lifetime has really given a shit whether or not their actions were within constitutional limits. But should Trump do this? Now, obviously, we all want to see drug prices become more affordable. But is this the best solution? And my answer is absolutely not. I took this news and made the statement that if the government really wants to lower drug prices, it will repeal all existing regulation, restrictions, and market barriers that it has created and fuck the hell off. And I got a nibble in the replies. And I'm not showing this as some attempt to call out Cole Trojan. I respect the man, and I think this is a totally valid response, and I think it's a really good question. And on the surface, to a lot of people, my response would sound callous or reckless or maybe even cruel to suggest that the government have no role in the regulating or the restriction of bad actors from the market. And it's only when we dive beneath the seemingly calm surface that we can explore all the inner workings of the current system and point out some major flaws in how it's designed and the incredible amount of harm the state has caused and continues to cause when it comes to this topic, and many others which I'll discuss in future videos. And the system ran in the United States, it is illegal to import drugs that aren't approved by our FDA. The FDA, of course, being the federal bureaucracy tasked with a monopoly power on approving substances for legal sale and use within the country. This means even drugs already approved on the market and in use in other countries around the world like Canada and the UK are effectively banned from importation into the United States. The United States government's prohibition on drug imports has severely restricted the world market for selling to the U.S., and more devastatingly has restricted U.S. consumers from buying. For those who don't understand the economic consequences that result from this system, what restricted competition does is it drives up prices and tends to weaken efficiency. Furthermore, according to a study by the Tufts Center, it costs about $2.5 billion to get a new drug approved by the FDA. And on top of that, only about 12 to 14% of drugs get the FDA's approval in the end. As for the amount of time it takes to finally get approved, the FDA has a target goal of 6 months for final approval, but in reality it can and often does take even more than a decade to get final approval. But isn't the FDA still an important organization, in that its goal is to create peace of mind within the public, that when you go pick something up off the grocery store shelf, that it won't cause you harm or even death? Isn't that a worthy goal? While I agree that it is, we have to look at the institution in practice. And the most important idea to keep in mind when granting power to the government is that results are more important than intentions. The FDA undoubtedly has kept certain substances off the grocery store shelves, which could have been anything from a waste of consumers' money to products that would outright kill the consumer. For instance, a popular example was a drug called thalidomide, which came about toward the end of the 1950s. It was used as a way to help pregnant women suffering from nausea. However, it turned out to have links to horrific birth defects. This was a big issue in some European countries where the drug was more readily available. However, in the United States, it wasn't. This is because the FDA had not approved the drug for use by the American consumer. And this is often touted as an example of the necessity and the wisdom of the Food and Drug Administration. However, we must again dive beneath the surface to discover some truths. The reason that the FDA hadn't approved thalidomide wasn't because the FDA had reviewed the drug and had deemed it to be harmful for the consumers. Rather, thalidomide's approval was bogged down in the bureaucratic process of drug approval. The FDA came out looking like a savior, when in fact it was only because the bureaucratic wheels turned so slow that it was discovered elsewhere during that time that the drug caused harmful side effects. But while the slowness of the bureaucracy worked well for Americans in this specific case, undoubtedly thousands of Americans suffer every year because the cost and access of drugs, legal and available elsewhere, is heavily restricted here in the United States. An example of this popular in the 1970s were beta blockers, a medication used for reducing blood pressure, which were never approved in the United States but were again available in Canada, the UK, etc. This cost the lives of tens of thousands of American citizens every year. And that's just the death count from one drug. What about the extreme pain and discomfort that comes with debilitating ailments? The incentive for the bureaucrat at the FDA, understandably, is always going to be to hold drugs off the market so that the backlash of a harmful drug hitting the market with your stamp of approval on it is diminished. This is a natural incentive, but it's an incentive that places entirely too much power and control in the hands of a single arbiter of safety. So how would this work in a stateless free market system like I advocate? In a stateless market, or basically a market without coercive theft or taxes, funding government monopolies, where bureaucrats are the ultimate arbiters of what you can legally consume as treatment for an ailment, the factors of regulation would rely on basic incentives and a simple system that recognizes that there will be penalties if someone is done bodily harm by consuming a medication that was unfit for consumption. Basic incentives. 1. As a consumer, you are going to have to be convinced that when you take a medication, that it isn't going to hurt or kill you. That's already the case in the current system. 2. A business which sells the product. You're going to have to be convinced that when you sell a medication, that it isn't going to hurt or kill your customer. Again, this is already the case in the current system. Why? Because customers who consume fake medical poisons from your store aren't likely to be repeat customers, whether because they were injured by your product or because they died as a result of your product. On top of that, how is business going to be affected when word gets out that you're selling poison to your customers? 3. If you're a company who produces or manufactures a product, you're going to have to convince both the consumer and the business that your medication is safe and fit for consumption for the above stated reasons. Like all safety regulating, this is a perfect opportunity for the market to provide a peaceful and voluntary alternative to the violent, coercive, bureaucratic monopolies imposed by the state. Getting a seal of approval from a reputable private quality inspection organization would be on par with stamping a guarantee on the box of your product. Again, relying on the reputation of a respected track record for quality and competing with other quality inspection organizations, the market would offer a better and more peaceful alternative for easing the minds of consumers. That being said, let's say regardless of any rational understanding of how to get repeat business, how to keep money rolling in for the production of your product, how to avoid serious penalties for injury or death of your consumers, let's say someone does get injured or dies while using a product. 1. This already happens now, under the current system, with all the coercive taxation, bureaucracy, waiting times, higher prices, and books worth of federal restrictions and regulations. No one is expecting utopia, and the underlying rule of shit happens is basically, whether we like it or not, a fact of reality under every system, as we are a bunch of relatively smart monkeys flying through space on a rock made of dirt and water. There is no utopia or nirvana. 2. Like today, in the situation mentioned, there will be recourse. I'll make future videos on how society could be structured in a civilization without a government, but for our purposes here, it's entirely plausible to have a system of privatized dispute resolution, where instead of the state being rewarded with fines or penalties, or crowded jailhouses, the amends would be received either by the consumer themselves or by their family or benefactors. Again, I stress, this is already the way the world works in the current system. Only this would be without all of the additional government-created problems and hassles. But now that we've covered that, it's impossible to talk about medication costs without visiting yet another area where the government has failed the citizenry. Patents. In the current system, our government grants an exclusive monopoly to owners of patents to specific drugs. As I mentioned earlier, the inevitable result of this monopoly is a restriction by law of competition, which in turn drives up prices and drives down efficiency. In a free society, patents would not exist. If you created a product in a free society, you would be able to reap the rewards of your creation, but you would not be able to use the coercive force of the state to prohibit others from bringing competition to market. In the case of medicine, the case is absolutely clear that the state is the driving force behind higher prices and inefficiency in our system. Have you ever heard a certain self-professed democratic socialist argue that it's absurd for certain medications to be dirt cheap in Canada, while the costs in the United States are sky high? Look no further than the very government people in this country think we need in order to be safe and secure. Also, conveniently, the very government these democratic socialists want to expand greatly. Undoubtedly, there will be a reaction to this as being unworkable, unthinkable, unreasonable, or even utopian, though I think I clearly expressed how that is not the case. I'm saying we can have a freer and less bureaucratic existence that will result in lower prices for medicine. Now, in the current system, we do have a government. So what can be done pragmatically now to ensure that people aren't forced to pay such high prices for their medicine? It's not going to come down to mild reforms, or, I cringe to think, handing the entire medical field over to the government, who has been far and away the number one cause of higher prices, scarcity, and bureaucracy. In the current system, the only thing you can do is cross your fingers and hope that your statist overlords are going to care enough to undo basically everything they've done in at least the last 50 or 60 years. It's their fault the system is failing and prices are rising. The only healthcare solutions being offered in mainstream politics is to completely socialize the system, which will be a complete disaster. The other side of the argument wants to take tiny steps to tweak or alter a horrible, unworkable corporatist system that hurts the average American for the benefit of pharmaceutical companies and is only made possible by the very state people are convinced they need to keep them safe from the blunders, incompetence, and inefficiencies that more often than not are either caused or greatly exacerbated by that very state. Thanks everybody for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it, whether you agree or not. I'm sure most of you will not agree, but at least maybe it'll give you something to think about. These conversations about how we could have a society without a state, I think, are fascinating. I've moved further towards the anarcho-capitalist position of stateless, rules without rulers systems. Reading a lot of Murray Rothbard, obviously, For a New Liberty, Power and Market, Anatomy of the State, America's Great Depression. I mean, there's so many great Rothbard books that I've read here recently. I'm currently reading even more. I'm looking forward to reading Ethics of Liberty. Stefan Molyneux has 2 books on anarchy that are great. Everyday Anarchy, which is really good. But what is phenomenal is his book, Practical Anarchy. I think they're incredible. They're thought-provoking. They're inspiring. I think the ultimate goal would be to try to find a system that we can work that does not have a state. The state is just so horrible at so many things. I think it's at least thought-provoking and interesting to try to find a way that we could have a system, how a system could work without this exclusive power to legalize thefts and abuses that the state has. But there's really great reading material out there. Hans Hermann Hoppe has a book on private production of defense. Robert Murphy has a book called Chaos Theory. There's some really interesting stuff out there that I've read here in the past couple of months that has just been really inspiring. So I look forward to more videos like this. More content like this. There's so many different topics. I think once the videos come, I think I'll eventually put all this down into another book. For those of you who don't know or maybe don't remember, back in 2014 I wrote a book basically about my arguments against Christianity, why I'm an atheist. I think there will most likely be another book that's going to come out by me that is going to compile all of these thoughts I have on how the state is just awful, how it has racked up a body count, how it's extremely oppressive, and how we can have a functioning society based on voluntarism and peaceful cooperation while still having rules. So stick around if you are interested in that content. I plan on making more of it. But thanks for watching.